Jason, Disney asked me to do this podcast thing. I need some advice.
You've got to have banger guests.
Walker and Leah. Daniel Deemer.
Tim Simons.
Adam Copeland.
You're the one asking the questions.
How? Why?
And they better answer.
I don't know anything.
Epic.
This season is just makeup.
Quest.
I'm Arian Samhadri. Welcome to the Percy Jackson and the Olympians official podcast.
Available wherever you get your podcasts. And watch season 2 of Percy Jackson streaming now on Disney Plus and Hulu. Learn more at disneyplus.com/whatson.
Vitamin Water Zero Sugar has great taste, zero BS, and obviously zero sugar. For those with zero room in their calendar. Zero patience for slow walkers. Those who get 0 hours of sleep on a Saturday night. Have zero filter, zero given, and zero interest in grabbing a plain, boring water. Grab a delicious Vitamin Water Zero Sugar today.
Meet the computer you can talk to. With Copilot on Windows, working, creating, and collaborating is as easy as talking. Got writer's block? Share your screen with Copilot Vision to help spark inspiration, and use Copilot Voice to have a conversation and brainstorm ideas. Or maybe you need some tech help. With Copilot Vision, Copilot sees what you see. Let Copilot talk you through step-by-step guidance so you can master new apps, games, and skills faster. Try now at windows.com/Copilot.
Wonder-working power in the precious...
Incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria.
You may wish to adjust the dial you are currently tuned into.
The wrong station. The Battle of Elanthe, the bombing of Ocasto, the massacre of Terrianus Gamma. It would push any pilot to the edge. So he flew more recklessly, weaving in and out of fire beams, turning at the nick of time to avoid thermosyles and orbital minefields. He needed to taste annihilation. He needed the stench of adrenaline. He needed the fear outside to match the fear inside. He wasn't the only one in his squadron feeling this way, but he was the furthest along. Most would have tapped out, either retiring or making the jump to private security for convoys, a place where they could forget what they'd done. But he wanted more than to forget. It was during some standard bombing run that he'd finally cracked fully and completely open. The mission was to float by over 100,000 clicks above the target, drop their payload, and then head back. They wouldn't even see the bombs break atmo, let alone watch them detonate on the cities below. As they left the system, he happened to look out his cockpit window. His ship was passing a bright blue planet dotted with islands, a world of water. He asked for details, and the bio-droid fed the info onto the screen. The planet had no name as of yet, just a number designation, Aleph 77247. He looked back through the window. The blue was so intense. He remembered swimming in the bright blue water at the quarry near his grandfather's place. He'd nearly drowned that summer. He could still taste the limestone filling his lungs and feel his grandfather's strong hands hoisting him from the water. And as he remembered this, some essential support beam inside of him collapsed. He looked back at his now empty bombing bay and knew that his grandfather should have let him die. So he turned off his comms, pointed the nose of his bomber straight down at the planet, and gunned the throttle. His commanding officer ordered him to turn around. His squadron sent panicked messages. He never heard them. The ship hit atmosphere like a ton of bricks. Friction turned the ship red, then orange, then yellow as it began to melt. The sound was incredible, a pounding roar, like a wave that never stopped. His ears filled with blood as the G-force knocked his head back, pressed his brain against his skull. His eyes closed, and consciousness left him. And then he woke up, alive. A stick-like bug was crawling across his arm, tickling the few hairs that grew out of a scarred patch of skin. He brushed it away and sat up, rubbing his head. He was in an ancient forest. Tall trees towered all around him, not growing in ordered rows like they did on his homeworld, but everywhere and at all angles. The biggest ones had roots as thick as 2-lane roads that ran through each other in massive knots. Vines dripped down from the canopy, so high above that there was no way to see where they started. He limped towards a break in the trees, aware that someone had mended his leg using the ship's first-aid limb brace. When he reached the break, he found that he could see out to a triangular sand beach, which ran out to a dagger point. Waves crashed on either side of it, meeting in the middle. And there, sticking out sideways from the sand, was the starboard wing of his ship. Stunned, he clambered down to the roots and tree trunks until he reached the water. He surveyed the wreckage. The port wing of the ship was scattered around. He'd come in so hot, the sand around the crash had turned to glass, and the metal wings had softened and twisted up into crazy shapes. The ship was all still smoking, still hot enough that the waves made bursts of steam each time they crashed over the metal. He was alive, and the ship was in strangely good shape. It made no sense. A polite beeping next to his hip. He sighed. Of course. The biodroid. Basic protocol says that when a pilot is incapacitated, the biodroid takes over. It had pulled them out of the death spiral, and without any way to initiate a safe orbital jump or a safe touchdown, it had aimed them towards whatever looked most like a landing strip. This beach. This was a crash site, yes, but a controlled crash site. The pilot had flown a mission when he was younger that had ended in a similar crash. Unconsciously, he touched the cold metal D-port on the back of his neck. If he knew how to land a ship in those conditions, then so did the droid. He looked down at it, and it looked up at him with silicon and aluminum eyes. "Safe?" it asked in its wavering digital voice. "Hungry," he replied. "Very hungry." It rustled around in its storage compartment and retrieved some large mango-like fruits and a dead mollusk. "Safe," it said. "Thank you, droid," he said. The droid handed him the fruit. He took a bite, and it was mild and tasted of cardamom and custard. He reached for the mollusk, but the droid pulled it away. It looked at his leg, pointedly, then back at the pilot's face. The pilot grimaced. "And thank you for the splint. You did an excellent job," he said. "Now give me the shellfish." The droid beeped happily and handed it over. He'd hated the droid from the moment he laid eyes on it. Biomechanics were no mystery to him. Half the galaxy was enhanced. But biodroids, all biodroids, were an outrage, a parody of life. They'd grown it in a vat, using cells swabbed from his inner cheek, layering muscle and fat and skin onto the electronic skeleton. They even shared the same blood type, damn it. Then they'd taken him and the droid to the neuro division and copied his tactical memories so they could be downloaded to the droid's brain. He still remembered what it felt like to have two of the same memory in his head at once. Like déjà vu, but nauseating. They told him the droid was meant only as a failsafe and a backup. It couldn't fly the missions. It wasn't as capable as a real human being, but it could get the ship home if he was incapacitated. Protocol said it was just supposed to sit there and be quiet. Like a parachute. But then, of course, protocol changed. It turned out the droids were just human enough that they needed a certain amount of freedom. For maintenance purposes, You had to let them wander the ship. You had to let them ask their idiotic one-word questions. You had to let them study the flight plan and offer inane suggestions. Not that anyone took them seriously. The pilot sat in the shadow cast by the wreckage of his ship and watched the droid struggle to gather the broken pieces of fuselage. He hated it. Every time the droid put its back to him, he thought about killing it. He was a good shot. A great shot, even. It would be so easy, and he wouldn't have to look at its revolting little face. But that would have to wait. His leg was still broken. Who knew what lived out in these jungles? The droid had spent most of its life in the ship. It wasn't allowed to leave because what if the pilots need to scramble for an emergency? Not that it had any reason to leave anyway. Droids didn't eat. They didn't sing. They didn't dance. The ship had a power supply and a place to fold up and deactivate. It was home. But this was a new situation altogether. The pilot was hurt and stranded on a strange planet. When they'd first made impact, the droid had been faced with the dilemma of leaving the ship for the first time since its birth. Traversing the beach and the edges of the jungle was shocking. Who could have imagined the feel of warm sand against flesh, or the sensation of shade on a hot day? So different from the cargo bay or the cockpit. The droid discovered that it could safely identify safe food and water, thanks to sensors in its fingers and a clever piece of code an engineer had stored in the recesses of its neurosilica brain. The droid found that it liked knowing these things. It liked it even more when the pilot relied on him to know these things. Sometimes the droid would hand the pilot food and not say anything. Then the pilot would look annoyed and say, "Safe?" The droid would confirm by saying, "Safe." It liked that. It liked that, for once, the pilot needed it. With the ship mostly destroyed, the droid was having to live off a strange emergency power supply. Food. For the first time in its existence, it had to eat to survive. No umbilical power cord connected to the reactor. It enjoyed the feeling of fullness, the different ways each energy source tasted. Electricity was satisfying, but it was all the same. This was different every time. When the pilot was asleep at night, he would lay down and look up at the triple moons and the stars. The droid knew every constellation. It knew the distance between each point of light. It could navigate from one to the others as easily as the pilot could breathe. But sometimes it turned off these functions. The stars were just stars. It was pleasurable to look at them. It took about a week for the droid to realize that they were never going to leave the planet. The droid found out the hard way. It had become more independent as the days wore on. It wandered from place to place, always returning with food and water for the pilot, but otherwise spending its time doing other things. One of those things was exploring the rubble left by the crash, which had scattered miles in every direction. The pilot awoke one morning to find the droid sitting in front of a blinking distress beacon. Miraculously, it had found one unbroken in the bough of a tree. The pilot ran over and destroyed the beacon with his pistol. Then he leveled the barrel at the droid. The droid made itself as small as possible, folding up until it looked like a little fleshy box. It quivered there for a moment until the pilot lowered the gun. The pilot sighed deeply. One wincing eye peeked out of the fleshy box. "Safe?" The droid's voice was muffled by its own chassis. "Yes, safe." The nightmares wouldn't stop. Every night he awoke in a cold sweat, another chapter of his so-called military accomplishments revisited. The only times he'd seen death up close were when he'd been down behind enemy lines, a POW in El Pisca, a raiding party in Gravenal 8. Bombing from orbit meant he never saw his handiwork firsthand. but he'd never been able to avoid the images of the aftermath. Mass executions stalked him from every newsstand, and war propaganda films blared from every government televisor network. His glorious work transmitted to view screens across the system. At first, he tried to ignore it. Then, over time, he'd become addicted to it. He'd spend weekends in the galactic archives, looking closely at each satellite image of the destruction he'd personally wrought. The destroyed buildings, the blackened bodies, the shadows on the walls. He'd wanted to feel the burn of shame. Now, on the beach, these images returned to him like loyal pets. Each time they did, he would startle awake, only to find himself on the beach in the shanty the droid had helped him build. The wind rustled the trees. The little droid slept by his feet, breathing metallically, dreaming of whatever droids dreamed about. He hated it. He envied it. The pilot had been working on something for the past few days, but the droid didn't know what it was. Each time the droid offered to help, he shooed it away angrily and went back to work. So the droid would only need to spend an hour every morning collecting food, and then the rest of the day was its own. More and more, it spent time wandering the forest. Beneath the enormous trees, it could watch the animals run in and out of their burrows, or glide from trunk to trunk. The leaves were enormous and translucent, acting like colored glass. The very air seemed green. There wasn't much daylight in space, just bright LEDs that imitated dusk and dawn. The droid knew now how feeble that imitation had been. Daylight was spectacular, dawn and dusk even more so. It was used to seeing red and purple and blue on the ship's control panels, but not in the sky. Not like this. As the light waned, the droid would sit in a steady bow with its head poked above the tree canopy. From here, it could watch the sun set behind the foothills in the distance. One day, when the pilot could walk without pain, the droid would take him to those mountains. In the meantime, it was content to eat fruit and watch the sun go down. The droid rotated its head 180 degrees and zoomed in. From where it sat in the tree, he could see the pilot hard at work. Privately, he wished he would take his injury seriously. He needed to rest and regain his strength. A few days later, the pilot called the droid over. He held what looked like a standard double-ended D-port cable, the sort the droid used to declutter its memory banks or back up essential information to the ship's central server. But in the middle of the cable, there was a mess of wires and motherboards. The droid cocked its head. "What is?" "It's for moving memories." "You know. I have some things I'd like you to hold on to for me." The pilot forced himself to grin. "It's so you can know me better. We're going to be here a while." The droid took a step forward, then hesitated. It whirred for a moment, then looked up at the pilot, meeting his gaze. "Safe?" "Safe. Yes, safe. Of course it's safe. You and your endless questions." The pilot spat. "Idiot droid. Sit down. Open your D-port." The droid cowered for a moment, then slunk over to the pilot. A little tone sounded, and the D-port cover on its neck snapped open. The pilot plugged the droid in, plugged himself in, then flicked the power switch on the transmitter. Almost immediately, the pilot started to feel the nauseating déjà vu of memory duplication, as if he'd lived his life twice. He flicked another switch, disintegrating the copies before they fully formed. Now the hard part. He focused on the worst of the memories. The Battle of Alanthe, the bombing of Ocasto, the massacre of Terrianis Gamma. Gritting his teeth, he brought the screaming faces to the front of his mind. He tried to experience them as fully as he possibly could. And as he brought them closer, he also felt them begin to fade, sinking into the droid's highly receptive neurosilica brain. The memories became more distant, as if they'd happened to someone else. A thin film of static seemed to stretch over the images. Slowly, it began to thicken until the details were lost like boot prints in a heavy snow. A loud buzzer blared next to his ear. The pilot snapped his head around. His droid was convulsing, shaking like an escape pod hitting Atmo. Steam vented from the soles of its feet. Suddenly, it rolled over completely 3 times, ripping the D-port cable out of the boot leg console. The pilot winced as the cerebral connection broke. He jumped up and ran to the droid's side. He was so close. The memories were almost completely gone. He just needed a few more minutes. His hands fumbled with the cable as the droid continued to seize. It was hard to unravel the knots with the droid flopping in his arms, but he did it. He reached over to plug it back in, but 2 strong, flesh-and-metal claws grabbed his wrists and held them fast. The droid wrenched itself free from his arms and threw him to the ground. By the time he stood back up, it was already halfway to the jungle. In a rage, the pilot drew his pistol and put the retreating figure in his sights. But he couldn't pull the trigger. He could still feel the memories lurking in his mind. Without the droid's neurosilica brain, there was no way to get rid of them completely. He watched as the droid sprinted away at 60 clicks an hour, maybe 70, kicking up sand and surf as it did. At the tree line, it leapt 12 feet straight up and cannonballed itself into the greenery. The pilot wandered back to the ship, rubbing at his inflamed D-port. In spite of the droid's escape, he grinned. It had worked. The memories were distant now, a part of his past rather than a part of his present. He felt lighter. The droid would be back, eventually. Then he would finish the job. The droid shut itself inside the hollow of a tree and folded up as small as it could go. It rocked back and forth, starting at every little sound outside. Agony. It was agony. Mangled faces and mushroom clouds. Horrifying images with no rhyme or reason, no connective tissue between them. And surrounding it all, death. A possibility the droid had never considered. To not be alive anymore. The memories swirled and swirled in its memory banks, with nothing to hold on to, no explanation for why they were there. No explanation except the one the droid couldn't face. That, somehow, this was all the droid's fault. Outside, night creatures were awakening for the hunt. Skeletal ribbon birds slithered through the air, sensing the presence of flesh. It drifted silently to the branch above the droid and pressed its narrow body against the tree until it was invisible. Then it struck. It threw the droid against the bark and, in the momentary surprise, wound itself around the robot's body. The droid struggled, twitching this way and that, only succeeding in digging the ribbon bird's hooks deeper. It did not know what to do. Then, the droid remembered the siege in Alpisca. Captured, tortured, bound with rope. A hidden pebble, sharpened by the meager light of 3 distant moons. He'd used his own teeth to do it, destroying all his molars until the stone was sharp enough to cut his bonds. The daring escape, cringing at each step, waiting for the burn of a laser to land between his shoulder blades. The guilt for those left behind be punished for his success. The droid felt it all. He was back there, in Alpisca. But no pebble, no escape. Unless it had utility tools in each mechanical claw. With the ribbon bird crushing the life from him, the droid activated them all at once. A flash of light as its drill, rivet gun, laser welder, solder iron, staple gun, sterilizer, and all the rest activated. The ribbon bird was torn apart. It fell to pieces along the tree branch, its blood spattering the leaves like raindrops, its bowels flayed open to the starlight. The stink of death reminded the droid of Alanthe. They'd called it a battle, but the droid knew it had been a massacre. The things he'd done, his hands on the fire beam, guiding it back and forth as the retreating bodies fell. Oh, God. In the hollow of the tree, the droid shuddered and rocked itself and blared its siren so loud that 2 miles away the pilot sat up on the beach, certain he'd heard something. 2 days passed with no sign of the droid. The pilot spent the daylight reinforcing his shanty and adding a tripwire that wrapped around the entire campsite. He connected it to the ship's landing lights. Without the droid, he had no early warning system. He wanted to be sure that whatever lived in the jungle couldn't get the drop on him. Between the tripwire and collecting food, he didn't have time for much else. The mollusks were hard to find, and the fruits grew very high on the trees. He shot the stems with his blaster pistol, knocking the fruits free. But the fall always bruised them. They didn't taste as good as before. But he found the work easy, even enjoyable. For the first time in years, the breeze didn't carry the remembered smell of death. One bogey camped out by a fallen ship, but who knew how many more were nearby? It could be a trap, trying to flush him out. That's what he would do. The droid's eyes clicked, zoomed in. Pattern on the bogey's jacket meant he was a pilot. The eye clicked again, switched to electromagnetic vision. No distress beacon anywhere in sight. What kind of pilot crashes but doesn't set up a distress beacon? The answer was obvious. It was a trap, no question. The droid army-crawled backwards, careful not to move too quickly in case other soldiers were nearby. He'd covered himself in mud and moss, impossible to distinguish from the green all around. The droid was hidden well, but if he was going to survive this supposed pilot in his ambush, he was going to need a real weapon. But why did the pilot look so familiar? And the ship as well. The droid searched his memory, but only found blood, destruction, and fear. He shuddered. If he did know the pilot, he didn't want to find out how. The nightmares were like faded holograms now, after the file had been run so many times that you can barely see the image anymore. Faint suggestions of terror, colorless flesh, mushroom clouds that weren't synced up with their thunderclaps. And then, all at once, blinding light flooded the shanty. The pilot woke up instantly and reached for his pistol. Something had knocked the tripwire. But the beach was empty. Nothing moved at the forest's edge either. There was a faint clattering sound in the ship behind him. The pilot turned toward the blinding light just in time to get knocked over by a small, chittering thing. He pulled his pistol and fired, missing wide. The thing jumped out of the way and leveled whatever weapon it had stolen from the ship. It pulled the trigger. Nothing. Whatever it was broken. The thing stood there, snarling for a moment, and the pilot had just enough time to recognize the droid before it charged him. It bashed the shanty's main support beam with its useless weapon and collapsed the entire structure on top of the pilot. When he'd freed himself, it was only to see the droid escaping back into the jungle. And this time, he did try to shoot it. Dawn found the jungle covered in bright red blossoms, the beginning of vine flowering season. High in the trees, the droid tinkered with the stolen firebeam cannon. It hadn't slept a wink all night. Every snapping twig and falling leaf was an enemy battalion surrounding his position. The few moments when he'd almost slept, the nightmares had woken him up. His hand twitched incessantly, making it hard to aim the finger with the built-in soldering iron. He missed a connection point entirely, and the guts of the cannon started sparking and smoking. Rage boiled through him. He hurled the cannon down to the forest floor, already coated in the short-lived red blossoms. Then it was quiet. The droid leaned against the tree trunk and tried to calm himself. He folded up as small as he could and closed his eye. He could hear his heartbeat. He'd never noticed he had a heartbeat before. No, those were footsteps. The droid opened his eye and extended the periscope. About 30 meters away from the trunk of his tree, he could see the decoy pilot carefully stepping around the red blossoms, making his way toward the destroyed fire beam. He was wearing a pack, no doubt carrying weapons and detection radar. The droid pressed himself deep into the hollow. Stupid. Throwing the gun was stupid. The pilot was shouting something. "Droid!" he called out. "Droid, I'm not going to hurt you. You can come out. I'll help you feel better." The droid extended its periscope further. The pilot was past the tree now, looking at the discarded weapon with his hands on his hips. Which meant, as quietly as possible, the droid slipped out onto the tree trunk and began to climb. It climbed until it reached the canopy, then began to leap from branch to branch, moving only when the breeze shook the leaves. In no time, it had reached the tree line. Then it jumped down 100 feet, rolled, and started sprinting to the crash zone. All the while, the pilot wandered the jungle, calling out to the droid, who wasn't there. The pilot spent hours wandering the jungle, watching the red vine flowers float down around him. It was a beautiful place. Maybe he could be happy here, once the droid was taken care of. But if the droid was still out here, it wasn't willing to show itself. Not yet, anyway. So the pilot began to trek back to the beach. But when he reached the tree line, he stopped short. Call it intuition. Call it a memory of a memory. Whatever it was, the pilot knew it would be a mistake to leave the trees. There was information they now shared that they'd never shared before. On Gravenal 8, he'd been part of a landing party. The pilot had stayed with the ship, only to be ambushed after the soldiers had left. He'd fought off an entire enemy platoon by luring them into the cramped ship one by one, where he dispatched them with his pistol. Since gifting most of that experience to the droid, the pilot's memory had become blurred and distant. He wondered, for the first time, if the droid had taken more than just the information. Had it taken the intensity as well? The impact? Was it as fresh as if it had happened yesterday? The pilot struggled to remember what it used to feel like to carry these horrors around. He dug as deep as he could. Then he remembered how he'd come to be on the planet in the first place, how he'd spent years haunted by faces, how it had worn him down, how, one day, he'd snapped, how he'd taken the yoke of the ship and aimed it towards a little blue planet covered in islands, and the rest of the memory was gone, but the implication was obvious. He closed his eyes. Shit. So that was what the droid was living with. From just inside the tree line, the pilot looked through his binoculars at the broken hull of his ship, still sticking halfway out of the sand. Let down. He flicked to thermal vision. Small, orange shape rustled back and forth inside the cockpit. There was a Magnashot rifle and a set of concussive grenades in the storage unit under the control panel. Standard for this class of ship. The droid knew that, of course. The droid wasn't going to die on this fucking rock. No fucking way. No fucking way. He'd kill if he had to. Hell, he'd slaughter if he had to. He'd done it before, and he'd do it again. The Magnashot rifle was heavy, but easy enough to balance. The guts of the ship had been ripped open by the impact, leaving a jagged metal hole that was big enough to walk through. The droid could stand in the pilot's seat and rest the barrel of the rifle on the headrest. As long as the cockpit stayed closed, it couldn't be hit from behind. If they wanted to kill him, they'd only have one way to get in. As the droid waited for death to arrive, he briefly wondered why everything in the cockpit seemed so much bigger than it was in his memories. The pilot didn't know much about the droid. He'd tried his best to ignore it completely, which meant he never picked up the manual, not even once. Which is why he figured he would just wait until nightfall to make his move. But the moment he stepped out of the forest and onto the darkened beach, he was hit by a sharpened spear of metal. It flew silently out from the night, moving so fast the tip of the spear was red hot. It pierced straight through the fat part of his calf, leaving a clean hole the width of a Sarduvian coin. The pilot yelped and jumped back into the forest. The Magnashot rifle needed no time to charge. The hypermagnetized coils could eject any metal object instantaneously. If anything, the problem was shooting too many of the ship's anti-armor spears. This thought was in the back of the droid's mind as he emptied a dozen more spears into the forest, trying to hit the retreating red and orange soldier. The droid adjusted the ill-fitting thermal vision goggles. No other shapes moved in the jungle. The droid powered down the Magnashot and the ambient static in the air disappeared. He counted his remaining spears. Not enough. They'd fought back the first invasion force, but more would come. The pilot had left a blood trail into the heart of the forest. He prayed the droid would be like him, too terrified to leave the ship, unwilling to hunt him in the trees. His pack laid open next to him. Bandages, flesh sealant, and synth blood packets were scattered on the ground. The pilot flexed his repaired leg. He'd stoppered the enormous wound with a hunk of stem cell gauze. Besides being lightheaded from blood loss, he was whole again. Although it would be another 10 years before any leg hair grew from the new flesh. He laid back in the blanket of red flowers and looked up at the stars. Clearly, he needed a new approach. No amount of synth blood could repair a 3-inch wide hole in his head. The adrenaline drained from his body. His breathing slowed. His mind prodded for answers. In time, he had a plan. The pilot was a terrible swimmer. In fact, he'd almost drowned as a child. He didn't really remember this quite so much as there was a hole in his memory that was the exact shape of almost drowning, if that made sense. If the memory wasn't there anymore, that meant the droid had it, and that meant the droid might have a bit of a blind spot when it came to the water. The pilot spent the next day roaming slowly through the woods in search of what he needed. He chopped down vines, pulled up roots, cut through stems, evaluating what he had at his disposal. Then he only had to wait for dark. In the ship, the droid couldn't sleep. It was the second night without any rest. He was feeling jittery. The memories rose up unbidden, like waves, and crashed over him. The droid scratched at his D-port. It had been irritating him lately. He tried to focus on other things, other memories that were buried deep within his brain. He remembered nearly drowning in the quarry. He remembered his grandfather's strong arms lifting him from the water, saving his life. He shuddered. He could taste the limestone. Then the other memories returned, and all he could taste was smoke and blood and death. For the millionth time, he asked himself, how could I have done those things? His head swiveled back and forth, watching both the beach and the hole in the ship's belly, waiting for the firefight to begin. Moments earlier, the pilot had begun his slow, careful walk along the dark ocean bottom. He wore his ragged orange jumpsuit, now tied down with rocks to fight the buoyancy of the salt. If he looked up, he could see the triple moonlight wavering in the ripples overhead. A long, hollow stem connected his lungs to the fresh air above. He was careful to exhale the stem as well. Bubbles might give away his position. He took another few steps, then looked back. There was nothing but darkness behind him. He wasn't sure if he was in the right spot. There was no way to tell. He would have to guess. He took a few more steps, untied the rocks, and then slowly walked up towards the shoreline. Instantly, he was hit by blinding light, his own early warning system. The ship was still a few dozen yards in front of him. He hadn't gone far enough. Blinking and shielding his eyes, the pilot bolted toward the ship, weaving back and forth as best he could in his soaking clothes. Ka-chunk, ka-chunk, ka-chunk. The droid's rifle shots narrowly missed, burying long metal javelins deep in the sand. Then the pilot was at the ship, tucked alongside the fuselage in a spot that the droid couldn't see from its perch in the cockpit. The pilot heard the egg-like glass door slide shut and lock. He was safe, for now. The droid was probably sitting in the pilot's seat, aiming his rifle at the opening in the belly of the ship, waiting for him to come in. Well, thought the pilot, let it wait. He brushed his fingers along the metal hull until he found the spot he was looking for. Thankfully, the panel wasn't warped. It popped off easily. Inside were bundles of wires and a series of switches. The droid couldn't stop shaking. He stared through the ragged hole, waiting for the assault to begin, rifle wedged into the command chair headrest. Who would it be? The Elanthi tribe, the citizens of Ocasto, the survivors of his Terrianis Gamma bombing run. Whoever came through. Deep down, the droid knew he deserved it. He deserved to die. So why did he hold the rifle so steadily? Why was his finger on the trigger? Why was he so ready, so eager to kill again? A sound, but not in front of him, behind him. It sounded like... The pilot pulled the manual release switch on the cockpit and simultaneously shorted out the eject mechanism. The glass cover sprang open, and the force of the ejection launched the surprised droid about 40 feet upwards toward the beach. The security lights blazed to life, illuminating the tiny body. As it fell, the pilot drew his pistol and took 3 shots, 2 hitting dead center, for the droid landed directly on its head. It spasmed on the ground, sparks and oil spewing from the wounds. Then it lay still. The pilot sat down next to it on the sand. It was fully incapacitated. Even with the night wind up, he could smell the fried circuits, the boiled blood. For a moment, he listened to the waves bubbling up on shore. The moons were nice tonight. He walked back to his destroyed shanty and returned, carrying his tools and his D-port cable. He plugged himself into the droid. The brain was still intact. He was as good of a shot as he'd hoped. He fiddled with the transmitter until he could feel the memories flowing. There was much work to be done. Whirring, and then a click. Systems functional. Chassis maintenance required. Attuned to bomber pilot, military code Delta F732A2. Error. Memory bank damaged. Seek pilot for further instruction. The droid opened its eyes. For a moment, bright sunlight overwhelmed its photosensors. All it could see was white. Then, a shadow stepped into its vision. "Hey, buddy," said the pilot. "How are you?" The droid flexed its fingers and hinges. "Whole," it said. "Functional." A little chirrup sounded from deep inside its brain, followed by a low-pitched buzzer. The droid cocked its head. "Remember?" The pilot turned to him. "Don't worry about it, droid. I'm just glad you're back." The droid looked more carefully at the pilot. He had gray hair and an unkempt beard. His skin was deeply lined and tanned. The droid compared this to the last photo it had of the pilot. It was surprised. The pilot seemed between 15 and 25 years older. He would need to update the personnel file. The droid stood up and dusted itself off, taking note of 2 new patches of rust. Took a few uncertain steps forward, creaking loudly with each movement. The The pilot knelt down and put his hands out in case the droid fell. "Asleep?" said the droid. "Asleep long?" "No, my friend. Not long at all." The droid took another few steps, this time toward a small home made from wood and parts of the ship. A wind chime made of mollusk shells tinkled in the breeze. Outside there was a workbench covered in tools. A dog-eared and water-damaged droid maintenance manual sat next to a half-filled bag of the pilot's blood. The droid looked at the pilot. He was staring back at the droid, which it couldn't remember the pilot ever doing before. His eyes were shining. Out of respect, the droid looked away. When he looked back, the pilot was holding out a mango. The droid realized that it was famished. It reached out, then stopped. It looked up at the pilot. "Safe?" "Yeah, little guy. It's safe." That night, the pilot awoke, sweating and terrified. This happened most nights. The Battle of Elanthe, the bombing of Ocasto, the massacre of Terrianus Gamma. The memories were with him, always. He paced the beach for a few minutes before he saw the droid, lying asleep, snoring slightly from the amateur repair job he'd done on his throat. He watched the droid's chest rise and fall. Rise and fall. Then the pilot went back to his bunk and eventually fell asleep. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Join us today at patreon.com/thewrongstation for bonus episodes, behind-the-scenes content, ad-free listening, and additional goodies celebrating our decade of dread. This week's episode, Droid, was written by Jacob Duarte Spiel and performed by Anthony Botelho. Thank you to Daniel Kahn, Rose, Ted and Annette Fleming, Nezami, Servant Lee, Fred, Matthew Snowding, Brooke Croson, Luck Rush, Melissa Papale, and Helena Moffat for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botelho, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citrin, and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow us on social media at The Wrong Station, or email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.